The reel begins with the sound of a projector, but the light doesn't warm the room, it interrogates it. Smoke drifts across the frame like a classified memo no one signed. And in that pale beam you glimpse soldiers who never got parades. Agents who learned that peace is only war with better manners, and mercenaries hired to do the things nations refuse to admit. Their faces aren't radiant, they are overexposed, as if the truth burned through the emulsion long before the censors arrived. In the aisles, posters promise heroism, but the images on screen keep slipping. A cut that jumps too quickly, a line that lands too heavy, a silence that lasts one beat longer than comfort allows. You realize the story isn't what survived the edit, it's what bled out on the floor. 5 films, scattered across a decade and a half, tried to tell us that victory can be a mask, that orders can sound like lullabies, that the enemy sometimes wears our reflection. What if the truth was never in the headline battle, but in the shadows after it ended? These are the 5 stories Hollywood tried to erase, but the cuts still bleed. The 80s and early 90s were supposed to be an age of clarity. Heroes wore flags, villains wore scars, and every story promised redemption in slow motion. But somewhere beneath the roar of engines and gunfire, another America was whispering. It was the America of shuttered factories, wounded soldiers, and men who no longer trusted the systems they once fought for. Directors working outside the studio walls began to ask forbidden questions. What if justice isn't real? What if the war never came home because it never left? Between 1983 and 1995, a handful of films appeared briefly, burned too bright, and vanished into the dust of forgotten VHS shelves. They weren't polished epics or Oscar contenders. They were raw, angry, uninvited, and too honest for comfort. Their creators shot on shoestring budgets, in decaying towns and backlots meant to look like battlefields. But what they captured was something studios couldn't edit away. The face of a country scared of itself. Each frame became a confession wrapped in bullets and smoke. Each hero, a man trapped between obedience and awakening. The violence wasn't the message, it was the disguise. Beneath the noise, the film reels were bleeding stories of control, rebellion, and the quiet terror of being free. Let's go back to the 5 films they never wanted you to see. Siege, 1983. It begins with a blackout Halifax, 1983. The camera trembles like the breath of someone hiding. A group of civilians, trapped in an apartment building, barricades the doors as a right-wing militia storms the streets. To most, Siege looked like another low-budget thriller. Guns, chaos, a siege. But beneath its flickering lights lies a film that dared to whisper what others wouldn't, that fear can wear a badge, that protection can turn into persecution. Directed by Paul Donovan, Siege was made in the shadow of a real Canadian police strike. Its villains are not foreign invaders but local extremists, filling a vacuum of law. When one of their victims turns out to be a gay man, the story becomes a mirror society under siege from its own silence. The violence feels improvised, the morality blurred, the light of justice flickering like a dying bulb. Hollywood ignored it. Distributors shelved it. Too political, too real, too uncomfortable for audiences still addicted to clean heroes. But within its grainy 16mm film stock, Siege captured something prophetic, a warning about what happens when those sworn to defend us decide who deserves to be defended. The reel hums again, and the next story begins. Best of the Best 3. No Turning Back. 1995. The American Heartland. Sunlight flickers through dust. Children play baseball, and the flag waves too perfectly. Then the camera turns and we see the swastika carved into the barn. Best of the Best 3. No Turning Back was never supposed to exist this way. It began as a martial arts franchise about honor, discipline, and unity. But by 1995, the world had changed. The Cold War was gone, and America needed new villains. The filmmakers looked inward, and what they found was too close for comfort. Eric Roberts returns as Tommy Lee, a man weary of violence, visiting his sister in a small Indiana town. But peace doesn't live there anymore. Neo-Nazis march in daylight, burning crosses and hiding behind freedom rallies. When they attack a local family, Tommy is forced back into the fight not for trophies, but for decency itself. On the surface, it's fists and fire, the language of video store action. Beneath it, the film trembles with something raw. A country losing its moral compass. Communities seduced by hate, disguised as patriotism. There are no clean victories here. Every punch lands heavier, as if Roberts himself knew that no amount of training can teach someone how to fight an idea. Critics dismissed it as formulaic. Yet today, it feels like prophecy. A quiet cry from a decade pretending it had moved past its demons. In the end, Tommy walks away again. Not triumphant, but exhausted because fighting evil that speaks your own language leaves scars no metal can cover. The reel turns, the light flickers, and the jungle calls next. Eye of the Eagle, 1987. The screen opens in a haze of smoke and jungle heat, gunfire cracks, trees shudder, and men vanish into the green. Eye of the Eagle was one of hundreds of Vietnam War films made in the 1980 seconds, yet it stands apart, not for its glory, but for its exhaustion. Directed by Cirio H. Santiago, it was filmed in the Philippines with real soldiers as extras, men who knew the sound of panic too well. The film pretends to be action, a rescue mission gone wrong, bullets cutting through vines, but beneath that noise lies a confession. The war didn't end when the last helicopter left. It just changed locations. Our hero, Sergeant Rick Stratton, moves through the jungle like a ghost, searching for meaning in chaos. His mission is survival, but the real enemy is belief itself. Each explosion, each corpse, feels hollow, as though the film is asking, how many times must America replay the same story before it understands it was never about winning? The dialogue is sparse, the violence relentless, and yet, between the bursts of light and blood, there's an eerie silence, the silence of men who've realized their fight is pointless. Eye of the Eagle was sold as entertainment, but what it truly captured was fatigue, the moment a generation stopped believing in its own myth of heroism. It was forgotten, buried under louder war films that celebrated instead of questioned, but its shadow remained, fluttering like a torn flag over the idea of victory itself. The reel hums again, the cell door slams, and the next frame begins. Caged Fury, 1990. The first shot is neon pink bars, a flickering corridor, a woman's eyes staring through metal and shadow. On the surface, Caged Fury sells itself as late-night pulp. Leather uniforms, prison fights, whispered promises of escape. But beneath the smoke and cheap allure lies a film that exposes the machinery of exploitation itself, both on screen and behind it. Directed by Bill Milling, the movie follows a group of women trapped in a private prison run by corrupt officials and masked guards. It was marketed as a women in chains thriller, but the real bars are psychological. The inmates aren't just imprisoned, they're filmed, commodified, and consumed. Every scene of defiance is framed as desire, every scream softened into spectacle. What looks like rebellion becomes performance, a mirror reflecting Hollywood's own hunger for control. The camera lingers longer than comfort allows, not for lust, but accusation. It exposes the gaze that built entire genres out of suffering. In its own twisted way, Caged Fury asks, when does fiction stop imitating power and start feeding it? The critics called it trash. The audience half believed them. Yet 3 decades later, it reads like prophecy, a parody too close to truth, a movie that mocked its own captors while being sold by them. The bars were never metal. They were contracts, camera angles, and silence. When the credits roll, the screen doesn't free you, it just turns black. The reel clicks forward one last time, and the lights of Los Angeles flash across the lens. Extreme Justice, 1993. The sirens are off. The streets are quiet. A car drifts through Los Angeles at night, its headlights slicing through the fog like interrogation lamps. Inside sits a cop who has stopped believing in law and a city that has stopped pretending to be innocent. Extreme Justice begins where most police thrillers end, after the oath has already been broken. Directed by Mark L. Lester. The film follows Jeff Powers, played by Lou Diamond Phillips, a detective reassigned to a secret LAPD unit. Their mission is simple: erase criminals before courts can fail. What sounds like justice soon turns to execution. His superior, played by Scott Glenn, calls it cleaning up the streets, But every cleaning leaves a darker stain. The unit operates in alleys, warehouses, empty lots, the forgotten corners of a city built on illusion. Released months after the Rodney King riots, extreme justice hit too close to reality. The violence on screen mirrored headlines still burning in the nation's memory. Studios panicked. Theatrical release was pulled, and it was quietly buried on cable. Officially, the reason was timing. Unofficially, it was fear that audiences might recognize their protectors in the film's shadows. There are no heroes here, only men trained to mistake rage for order. Every bullet sounds like an echo from the real world, too loud to ignore, too honest to forgive. The final shot isn't triumph but reflection. A badge lying in a puddle, its light flickering between truth and guilt. Extreme justice didn't just blur the line between fiction and fact, it erased it. And in that silence, the real finally stops. There's one more film, one that never made it past the censors, never even got the chance to fail. In 1989, a small team of filmmakers in Los Angeles began shooting a project titled Shadow Patrol. It was meant to be another police thriller, a story about a special task force turning against its own department. But what the cameras captured went beyond fiction. According to production notes and interviews now buried in old trade magazines, the script was rewritten on set to reflect real LAPD scandals, corruption, cover-ups, and the manipulation of crime scenes. Actors received anonymous phone calls warning them to quit. Within weeks, the studio financing the film pulled out. The footage was confiscated for insurance reasons, and no one ever saw a single frame again. Only fragments remain, a few still photos, a partial script, and the haunting rumor that the film's final scene ended with a camera pointed at the audience, the narrator whispering, "You're part of this." It was supposed to premiere in 1990, but the reels vanished into legal limbo. Some say it was destroyed. Others say it sits in a private archive, labeled as something else entirely. Shadow Patrol became the phantom echo of every movie that dared to tell too much. It proved that sometimes the most dangerous story isn't the one you film, it's the one you try to hide. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. When the projector stops, the silence feels heavier than the noise ever was. The screen is blank, but the afterimage lingers, faces, uniforms, and cities that no longer trust their reflections. These films, born from the exhaustion of a nation, weren't about victory or defeat. They were about decay, the slow unraveling of a story America had been telling itself since the first Western rode into sunset. From the fog of siege to the heat of extreme justice, every frame carries the same pulse. Fear disguised as order, guilt sold as entertainment, truth hidden beneath choreography. They are not masterpieces of cinema, but they are X-rays showing the fractures beneath the costume of heroism. When the lights dimmed and audiences cheered, these movies whispered something else, that every myth needs someone to believe it, and every lie needs a screen bright enough to survive in. And maybe that's what makes them unforgettable, not for their perfection, but for their defiance. They remind us that film is not just illusion, it is confession. The real ends, but the real keeps playing in every uniform, every flag, every silence that follows applause. If these stories unsettled you, maybe that's the point. Cinema was never just about escape, it was a mirror, and sometimes the reflection blinks back. These 5 films weren't made to entertain. They were warnings written in celluloid, edited by fear, and hidden by time. But the real never truly stops. Every decade finds new shadows, new versions of the same lie, that justice is clean, that war is righteous, that silence is safety. So watch closer. Look at the edges of the frame. Listen to the hum beneath the dialogue. The truth is always there, flickering between the cuts, waiting for someone willing to see it. What other stories were buried before they could be told? And how many reels are still missing? Real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.